Seems like anyone that gets into sewing at some point wants to sew a t-shirt, but once they do some research and look into how difficult it could be, they sometimes put it on the back burner, visit it another time, or never revisit it. Sewing with knit is definitely challenging, no doubt about that. But in this video, I'll show you exactly how you could sew with knit, specifically how you could sew a t-shirt as a beginner. I have a t-shirt DIY kit for this as well. It includes all the supplies, the fabric. In my opinion, it's way easier for a first timer because instead of worrying about sourcing the right material and printing the pattern, you can use this kit knowing it has everything you need so you can focus more energy on learning the process of how to sew a t-shirt. So without further ado, let's get into it. The bulk of this video is going to be about the fabric, tools, and preparation leading up to sewing because the pattern itself is pretty straightforward. The body, 2 sleeves, collar. The sewing's straightforward, but it's having the right setup that's going to make this project a million times smoother. T-shirts are commonly made from cotton jersey, but for this video and for the DIY kits, I have French terry. It's a little bit heavier than cotton jersey, which in my opinion makes it a little bit easier for beginners to work with. You'll need 1.5 yards of t-shirt fabric. You'll need a sliver of rib knit for the collar. Usually you can only order like 0.25 per fabric, so 0.25 yards of the rib knit. And then you'll also want matching thread. This one is 100% polyester. It's all-purpose thread. And you typically want to get this over 100% cotton because it has a little bit more stretch to it. Best practice before any project, wash the fabric before using it. I recommend washing in cold water and then hanging to dry to avoid any shrinkage. Having the right tools for this project is going to make a world of a difference. Ballpoint needles are really important because regular needles will pierce the fabric and potentially skip stitches. The ballpoints have these rounded tips which allows the needle to pass between the fabric threads by separating them, which means it's way better for knit. Ideally, get the twin or double needles. This is probably the most important accessory for this project because it automatically allows for stretch just using your normal straight stitch option. But if you can only get a single ballpoint needle, then make sure your machine has either a stretch stitch option or a zigzag option. The walking foot is also another very helpful accessory. It avoids stretching the fabric when you're sewing, and it also helps stop my machine throat plate from eating the fabric. Major annoyance, big time. You definitely want to avoid this. If you're unable to get the walking foot, then keep the tissue paper that was included in the DIY kits. They're there for a reason, and use them as stabilizers when you're sewing. Odds are, if you're running into issues when you're sewing with this fabric, the tissue paper is going to help. Cut them into 1-inch strips, clip them to the path you're going to sew, and then remove them by hand after very gently. I even ran into some issues using a walking foot where the fabric tunneled between the 2 stitches. Even the slightest bit can block the feed dogs. So the tissue paper definitely helps keep everything low and smooth. These are the accessories I'd highly recommend. It's going to make sewing this project so much easier. So yeah. By the way, there's a lot of small details that get covered in this intro, so if it's easier, I made a complete guide to sewing knit. There's a link below, so if you'd rather skim that instead of going through this and trying to write all the notes and list out the items you need, feel free to check that out. Alright, let's get moving along here. Start with a highlighter and find your size in the size key to then highlight your cutting path. Grab your craft scissors, not your fabric scissors, and cut out the pattern. You can get access to the free sewing patterns in the link below for the digital PDF version, and then just search for a local print shop with a large printer, or if that's not possible, I have paper versions available for purchase as well. As always, keep the top left corner of the pattern because it has all the project details, so it's nice to have that organized with all your pattern panels and keep them all together. There's a cutting guide on the right side of the pattern to follow, so you can place your pattern pieces on the fabric accordingly, and just be aware of the orientation of the panels when you're cutting out your fabric. If there's a place on fold tab, then make sure to fold the fabric accordingly, and then when you're ready, clip the pattern to the fabric. Now's a good time if you have fabric weights to put them on the pattern, or if you don't, like in my case, just use like mini plates to hold the pattern down. Cutting knit can be kind of tricky because the fabric usually tends to have a lot of stretch to it. This means there's more room for error when you're cutting, so ideally a rotary cutter and cutting mat is best. With scissors, you're typically maneuvering the fabric to get the scissor blades under and around, and the lighter and more elasticity in the fabric, the more susceptible it is to error. For example, sometimes cutting on the floor and having all the fabric spread out is better than having the fabric hang over a desk, because when it hangs over a desk, it induces some stretch. And when you're done cutting, don't forget to notch where it says. Just do small 1/4 inch snips with your scissors. Before we construct this t-shirt and put it together, it's actually time to iron the hem allowance, because it's going to be a lot easier while the pieces are flat than later when they're all connected and rolled together. If you're curious what a hem allowance is, it's the excess fabric at the bottom of your t-shirt or the sleeves so that you could fold it over and get a nice clean finish on the edges. Wait a minute. Ironing is not that simple. So there's a few words of caution to be wary of when you're ironing t-shirts. First off, be aware of the right side and the wrong side. On French terry, it's very easy to find the two sides because they're very distinct. Another reason why I wanted the French terry in these t-shirt DIY kits, because the right side, it's very smooth, and the wrong side has all these rough loops. So make sure when you're ironing the hem allowance that you have the wrong sides together. Secondly, you want to have it on medium heat with no steam, and you only want to have it on for a few seconds max. You don't want it there for a long time, just a few seconds on and off. And my last bit of advice, the third piece to the puzzle, no circular or arced movements like you normally would, because that can easily stretch out the material, which we don't want. Just press it down for a few seconds, lift, and move on to the next section. To create that hem allowance fold, you can use a ruler and measure and maybe use chalk. Or you can actually use a thank you insert in the DIY kits. It has a 7/8 of an inch hem allowance added to it. So just use it as a folding guide. The material has a tendency to stay in place when it's folded, and then iron it down with a quick press. All right, so the fabric's prepped. Let's move on to setting up the sewing machine proper. The accessories you use will influence the sewing machine's settings. For example, if you're using a twin needle, you can use a straight stitch. But if you're using a single needle, that requires a stretch or zigzag stitch. I'm going to be running through all the steps using a walking foot and twin needle. But if you are using a different combo of accessories, the knit guide I made has all the different stitch settings listed. We're going to wind 2 bobbins because we're doing a double needle, and keep one of them on top for the top of the machine and the other one in the bobbin case below. And then when you're threading the machine, thread it like normal, but instead you're holding 2 threads. And then on that last hook, just ignore the 1 thread so that it helps keep them separate and prevents tangling. I'm going to have the stitch type to a straight stitch, the tension at 2, width at 0, length 2.5. The presser foot tension is going to be medium, and I'm not going to backstitch. For a walking foot on a standard sewing machine, it's not designed to do a back stitch. So instead, you could change the stitch length to like 0.5 at the very beginning and end of your stitch, so that those tiny stitches are a little bit tighter and they can help lock in the stitches. And then once you've done 3 or 4 stitches, put the stitch length back to your normal stitch length and continue sewing. And good practice before starting any project is test out your stitches with some scrap fabric. Always put 2 layers under there, because typically you're sewing 2 layers. If you're following my guide, start with those settings and then adjust according to your machine, because even with my settings on your machine, every machine can be slightly different, so just adjust accordingly. And then when I'm working with stretch, after I've stitched a couple times and I like it, I like to take the scrap fabric and just give it a little pull test just to see how stretch it could be. All right, almost 10 minutes into the video and we haven't started sewing yet, but we did cover all our bases. So let's start sewing. Start with panel 1 and 2 and clip them at the shoulders with right sides together. Try your best not to stretch the fabric. Instead of back stitching, I'm going to do those little baby stitches, those little 0.5s at the beginning and the end to lock them in. If you're using a single needle, do the 3/8 of an inch seam allowance stitch and use either a zigzag stitch or a stretch stitch. Once you're done that, we're going to do a quick press with our iron. Remember, no movement, just quick press up and down, and try to push the seam allowance to the back of the shirt. Now we're going to work on the collar, which is panel 3. We're going to fold it, iron it, only 2 to 3 seconds, and then sew the ends together. For turning on that curve, when you reach the midpoint where you want to turn, have the needle in the down position, lift the presser foot up, pivot the fabric, and then lower the presser foot back down to continue sewing. Now fold it inside out or technically right sides on the outside. To attach a collar to the neckline, it's going to be a bit tricky because the collar is actually smaller. This means that you'll have to stretch the collar to fit the size of the neckline. It seems a bit weird, but this stretches on purpose so that when it's attached and you put the t-shirt on, the collar lays flat with the body. To do this, we're going to divide the collar and neckline into 3 equal sections. Using measuring tape, we're going to measure the circumference of both and divide by 3. This number is going to be the key measurement to dividing our collar and neckline into 3 equal parts. Using the seam as a starting point, find the raw edge side, not the folded side, and make 2 notches using that measurement. For the neckline, there's going to be 2 notches. Choose any one of those as your starting point, and then make your other 2 notches to divide it into 3 equal parts. Lay panel 1 and 2 out flat with the right sides on top, and we're going to match up the notches from the collar to the neckline so that they're connected with clips at those 1/3 markings. If you got a free arm, use that, and we're going to stretch sew the collar to the neckline. Remember, the collar is going to be a little bit smaller than the neckline, so you have to slightly pull from the clips so that the collar stretches to fit the neckline. It's a bit tricky for beginners who are learning for the first time, but you want to pull slightly so that the collar and neckline are flush with each other, and let the machine feed dogs feed the fabric. And your hands just move with them as it's being pulled, but you're still maintaining that stretch so that the 2 fabrics are flush together. And again, we're going to run those baby stitches at the beginning and the end, or because it's a loop sew and we're going to end up going back to the starting point, you could just do normal stitches at the beginning and then do those baby stitches at the end once you've overlapped the original starting point. Alright, collar is attached to the neckline. We're going to do a quick iron to make the seam flat. Again, quick press, no movement. Once this is done, you're going to try on this tee. It's going to be this funny drapey thing, but if it fits, then we're going to do a top stitch. So this is when the twin needles also become really clutch because you can get those parallel stitches done with ease. You sew 1 time, you get 2 stitches. We're going to go all the way around. We're going to have the seam allowance pointed downwards away from the collar. And if you're using a single needle, then just push the seam allowance down and do a 1/4 inch stitch around the collar and the body. So you'll just end up having to do 2 stitches. Once all is well, we're going to work on the sleeves. So lay the body on your table and place the sleeve on top so that right sides are together. Find that big curved edge of the sleeve. It's opposite to the hem allowance edge, and line that up with the sleeve opening on the body. We're going to match the middle of that sleeve to the notch on panel 2. Use sewing clips to attach those together, and then from that middle point, clip the rest of the sleeve to the body from that midpoint outwards. When you're clipping this together, it might be a little bit difficult, but you want to rotate the sleeve to match up to the edge of the body. Try your hardest not to stretch the fabric when you're doing this. I know it's going to be hard, but once that's all clipped together, you're going to sew them together. When that's done, we're going to press the seams, just that quick press and done. We're going to push the seam allowance towards the body. So push it towards panel 1 and 2, not towards the edge of the sleeve. Repeat those steps for the other sleeve, and then let's move on to the body. Have the shirt folded at the shoulders so it's right sides together, and then find the armpit seam and clip it, but make sure you try your hardest and your best to match up those seams together because you really want to make sure they're lined up for when you flip the shirt right sides out. Clip the rest of the body starting at the armpit and clipping outwards. Again, try your best not to stretch out the fabric at all. You can kind of see a pattern of finding the middle or finding the seam, clipping that together, and then from there clipping outwards. This is because when you're working with fabric like this, it's so easy to stretch and misalign seams. So to prevent that, we start by clipping at the seam or the middle and then going outwards. Once the whole left and right sides clip together, sew from the armpit outwards. So you're going to do that twice for each side. One from the armpit going down to the bottom hem of the shirt, and then once from the armpit going outwards to the sleeve on the left side, and then you're going to do the same thing for the right side. Again, baby stitches, those tiny little 0.5 ones at the beginning and the end, just to help lock in those stitches. Now we want to lock in the hem allowance to finish up the tee. Again, with that twin needle, this is why I love it so much. It gives you that professional look you see on most t-shirts with the double stitching. find the ironed folds that we made at the beginning for the hem allowances, line those up with the 7/8 of an inch marker on the throat plate, and sew away on the bottom of the t-shirt and the 2 sleeves. If you're using a single ballpoint needle, you're going to match up the fold to the 3/4 inch marker to help make sure your stitches are catching that bottom fold that you can't see. A reminder, this is going to be loop sew, so you don't really need to lock in those beginning stitches. Just make sure when you're coming around to overlap at the starting point and then do your baby stitches or back stitch to lock them in. If you finish this project, share pictures and tag @glory.allan. Subscribe to my channel for more DIYs, and until next time, peace.